Good afternoon and welcome to the seminar organized by the Strategic Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies to discuss the genocide in Gaza after more than 30,000 martyrs and 75,000 injured and the vast majority of the population being internally displaced. From a humanitarian point of view, we will be exploring the humanitarian security with a special focus on water security, food security. We'll have three speakers today. I will be introducing them. We'll start with our colleague, Laurent Lampert, who is an assistant professor at the Doha Institute. He got his PhD from Oxford University and the MA from Sorbonne in Paris. And he has been director of the lab at Qatar University, and prior to that at Oxford University, and for the last 15 years was an expert with the UN, the French Defense Ministry, the African Union, and Dr. Lampert, the floor is yours. شكرا جزيلا للدعوة. أود أن أشكر كل
I think it's indeed very important to deal with the situation in Gaza. You've reminded us of the statistics, which are getting worse by the day. I have made a small presentation to share some ideas as to a different approach to the ongoing situation in Gaza. Mainstream media tend to portray the situation in Gaza from a conflict approach in a classic sense, with military fightings, and as an outcome having a growing number of victims, as if there was a classic mechanic of fighting producing victims. These are collateral damages. We can't do war with this. So are we told. But my small presentation will tend to a bit scratch the surface to show that there is something deeper than that. So with regards to the limited time, I will just focus on the human security framework, which can be used to rethink a bit this approach to the ongoing war in Gaza, and to see actually if not a genocide is being committed in Gaza. I will not take a legal approach. This has been very well done by colleagues abroad, including the South African delegation at the Hague, at the International Court of Justice. I will work as a geographer, working with environmental matters, the matter of ecocide, and again, human security, or in Gaza, the lack thereof. So first, I would like to highlight that, again, the situation in Gaza is not simply about military fighting. This is a narrative we need to reject, and we will see. First, there was a blockade long before the ongoing war, but it got worse. The second is that point I would like to raise, and then we will go through this during the presentation, is that environmental matters are not peripheric. It's not a nice consideration that some tree-hugging, nice environmentalists love to speak about, but we should just talk about the serious things. Actually, it's so serious that it is central to the plans of the Israeli administration. And the third thing is that I would like, throughout this presentation again, to introduce the concept of genocide and human security, and link the two of them, again, to highlight new dimensions, or if not new, at least underreported dimensions of the war on Gaza and its people and environment. So first, genocide. We have read, I think, most of us on it extensively, especially in the recent period. And genocide, again, is about, with intent, destroying whole or part of a group. And we will focus on three elements. The killing members of the group, so this is quite obvious. We see, and again, you reminded us of the number of casualties. We see the very serious bodily or mental harm being inflicted. And here we'll highlight especially the group conditions of life, which are radically deteriorated, not just in the short term, not just for the time of the conflict, not just for the time of the so-called operations in Gaza, but for the long term. And this has been made on purpose. And this is made, I argue, to bring the physical destruction of the group. Because a group cannot live without an environment. We all live and depend on the environment where we are. If this environment is destroyed, what does happen to the group? So human security is a notion that emerged in the 1990s to go beyond the classic idea that defense of a nation is just the defense of its core classic interest, and it's just a military matter first and foremost, with some economic elements added. But in the 1990s, there was decided increasingly that matters of the well-being of the population were part of the human security. That if you had a whole population whose life became miserable, then this was a failure of the government to protect the population. There was also the idea that dignity had to be protected, but also, again, the ecology, the ecosystems especially. So it draws from various disciplines: political ecology, human rights, development studies, and so on, and geography, of course. The UNDP has been pushing for it a lot, and Amartya Sen, Al-Kaya are some of the key scholars known to have developed some dimensions of it. Developing the idea also that, for instance, freedom and the capacities are very important. And I would say, as a geographer, what are the capacities of a population when its means of production, including agricultural production, are being destroyed? Where is the freedom? Where is the economic security? So this idea of human security emphasizes the protection of individuals from many threats, as you've understood: economic deprivation, conflict, repression, environmental degradation. To some extent, to be fair, this is also why it is often considered a too broad approach, because some argue, well, it seems that human security tries to encapsulate everything, and when you try to be so inclusive, at the end of the day you address nothing, or nothing properly. I would beg to disagree, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this is something which is regularly debated. There are several ways to represent thus the human security as a framework. This one is interesting. We see that human security now is the center, not the state, as it used to be in a previous century, for instance, where for the state everything could be sacrificed. Let's remember that during World War I or World War II, millions of soldiers from each warring parties were sacrificed to protect the state. The idea of the shift is that now we should really protect the population, and then the policies of the state have to reflect that, with environmental security, personal security, economic security, etc. There are even some other frameworks which are further developed, but we don't have time to go through this, though I highly recommend exploring these dimensions. We've seen during the Arab Spring how dignity can be important to political stability and the well-being of a population, becoming central to some protests. Now, very rapidly, we know the realities of Gaza before October 7th, and I will not go too much into detail. I would love to have the time to make a course of geography about it, but I'm sure this would be for another time. But what I would like to highlight is that even before the current episode of war on Gaza, if I may say, there were concerns about water. There were concerns of restriction across Palestine, And Gaza used to be very often the forgotten thing. The forgotten thing, why? Because although we have a lot of maps, a lot of data about what happens in the West Bank, we have much fewer data about Gaza. By the way, what we have owes a lot to the UNRWA, which is highly criticized these days, but a lot of the development that we see in Gaza wouldn't be possible at all without them funding some of the researches. But the water in Gaza is a major problem. What we see here are resources which are split, areas which are split. And Gaza, to some extent, is one big split territory, disconnected from what it had depended on for centuries. To make a long story short, the ecology of Gaza is that of a dry land. A dry land tends not to be self-sufficient in terms of food production, and when the population grows, such as after the 1948 Nakba and the coming of an increasing number of refugees, it generally tends not to be even water self-sufficient. So then you need to trade, and you need a lot of communications. But with this, the atomization of Palestinian land, Gaza cannot function anymore. So this is one major thing to understand. Now, again, I don't have time to go through the details, but what I would like to highlight now is that after October 7th, what we have seen a lot is this. Pictures of raw destruction, generally represented in urban settings. So this is indeed immense destruction. For anyone used to conflict, we see that the means of destruction deployed were very significant. As we know, during the first week of the bombing over Gaza, the equivalent of a year of bombing in Afghanistan has been used, or more actually, and we now have the details of the kind of bombs which have been used, which are extremely heavy, actually not appropriate for the kind of so-called targeting, if they were targeting at all, Hamas, actually. So this is something that we could further explore, and that we will further explore, because we're teams of people researching the destruction and the kind and characterizing the destruction that the Israeli army has been doing. But this is in another research. Now, what I would like to highlight more in this time is that this is the kind of pictures we see less. And in Western media, we see not. This, by the way, this is a rare picture that comes from The Guardian, so this is quite of an exception, where they highlight the fact that the Israeli army has been purposefully destroying, as you can see here, agricultural fields in Gaza. In the east of the Gaza Strip, there is some relatively fertile soil. It's not Ukraine, clearly, but you could have agriculture. The soil has been destroyed, the water has been destroyed, destruction of the hydraulic infrastructure, and as we can see, destruction also of a lot of greenhouses, and destruction of a lot of tree crops on purpose. So when asked about this, the Israeli army says Hamas fighters are hiding in orchards, in fields. I have some doubts about the extended damage of the agri-systems, agricultural ecosystems, being damaged because of the huge presence of Hamas fighters there. It's a very bad place to hide, but we can see here the amount of destruction, which also can be reflected in some of the statistics. 48% of Gaza's tree cover has been destroyed, partly or fully, between 7 October and 21 of March. This means that the livelihoods of population has been destroyed. In addition to which, the IDF has announced that it would use vast amounts of water to flood the tunnels of the Hamas. Not explaining, by the way, that all this salty water coming from the sea would salinize the limited fresh water underground, basically destroying not only the capacity to make agriculture with underground water, agriculture which cannot be made with desalinated water, it's too expensive. It requires too much energy, too much infrastructure. I mean, if you want a potato at $0.50, okay, but this cannot happen in Gaza. So there is this purposeful destruction of the water underground, but it has not been reported much. We see that there has been a destruction of the infrastructure. We see these pictures of people queuing hours to fill in some whatever containers they can have, but we rarely hear that much about the fact that the destruction of the water infrastructure, and especially the sewage infrastructure, means that every day you have 100,000 cubic meters of sewage spewing into the sea. 100,000 cubic meters of sewage a day. For you to have an idea, that's roughly what the Jordan River debit is. So we have a river of sewage going into the sea. Now we may say, why is it so important? Well, Gaza has a coastal aquifer, which means that underground there are interactions between the sea and between the underground waters. If you pollute the seawater close to the coast, you will pollute the underground water further. That means you will have cholera outbreak, diarrheas before, and then cholera outbreaks, further death. This is already happening. We have a lot of kids who are suffering. Kids tend to be more fragile. Kids and the elderly will be the first to be sick. There are already reported deaths due to diarrheas. And it is set to increase, I'm afraid to say. So this is indeed an ecocide. The Geneva Conventions, by the way, forbid the targeting of civilian infrastructure, but they were not respected, as we all know. So this is documented for the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Now, rapidly, because I think I went through my points, there is abundant hard evidence that the environment is central to the warfare being waged. We should just remind what the Minister of Defense had said about the on-purpose cutting of water, electricity, fuel, food. What is it, if not a policy to kill a population by depriving it from means of livelihood and existence? The Israeli army seems indeed to be working and making life unlivable in most areas of Gaza. I say most, it's not everywhere, but most areas of Gaza. And interestingly, there is a strong correlation, we need to further work on the maps, between the key places where people live and where a lot of destruction has happened. So it seems to be made to make people live. But this, I have not further developed the evidence. We need to work further with colleagues of cartography. Now, does it contribute to the genocide? As a geographer, you understand my answer is yes, especially if we use a human security framework. Now, a holistic reconstruction that we will have to start working on very soon, even if the war is not yet stopped, will thus require heavy investments in ecological rehabilitation of agri-systems, of these fields the people depended so much on these greenhouses, on these water bodies, including underground water bodies and forestry. On this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. شكرا جزيلا دكتور لامبرت.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert, for this intervention. In it, you provided us with very good points of the destruction of the environment, agriculture, water resources. Now we move to our second intervention with Dr. Abdul Karim Qaziz to talk about the health security. Dr. Abdul Karim is an expert from King's College London, and he has many projects on northern Syria, and he got his master's from King's and PhD from Aleppo University, and he held many positions in the American University in Beirut, Chatham House, and Chemonex International, and Plummet International, and Global Integrity Organization. And he focuses on the impact of conflicts on health aspects. Dr. Abdul Karim, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Definitely, we are saddened to talk about this, and our people in Gaza are under this aggression for months now. I thank the Strategic Studies Unit for making me part of this discussion, and similarly to what Dr. Lambert has said, when we talk about the war in Gaza, we're not talking about a normal war. It's a war of genocide, and the people of Gaza are subjected to all sorts of genocide, including human security. And there is a correlation between conflicts and health security. I want, first of all, to elaborate on the relationship between health and wars, and how can the health be turned into a tool or a weapon in war. This is what we saw in Syria and the Ukraine, when the health facilities have been targeted and health has been used as a weapon. Please allow me, first of all, to speak in general terms on the linkage between health and war. In World War I, the number of deaths among soldiers only between 1914 and 1918 was around 37 million soldiers, but there are reports by the American Defense Department that most of these deaths were not as a result of direct wounds, but as the result of wounds, as a result of inflammations and other diseases, about 2/3 of them. Despite this huge number, the main reason for ending that war was not related to the casualties. These images are not of war casualties, but of patients in big hospitals which were established to deal with a new disease which was known later on as the Spanish flu, which killed around 40 million people. Some studies go as far as saying that the Spanish flu contributed to ending the World War I because the soldiers were so exhausted as a result of this epidemic, or they were exhausted because they could not continue the fighting. So therefore, World War I contributed to dealing with the impact of this epidemic or pandemic. And by the way, the Spanish flu was not recognized until 1937, so they were dealing with an unknown disease here. In 1951, some doctors noticed the role of the medical staff, doctors and nurses, in ending what Sir Richard Dole wrote in Lancet in the Korean War that doctors bear a huge brunt as a result of wars when they have to deal with not only the wounded but the ill people. So therefore they should advocate to put an end to wars, and for this reason the Medical Med Act was established. And we still are recovering from the COVID pandemic. So therefore, we should understand that pandemics do not recognize borders, and COVID had spread throughout the world, and the diseases we see in Gaza now may well spread to other countries, and we should have worked hard to prevent them from happening in the first place, or now work to end the war before they spread elsewhere. So what is human security? In brief, we say there are two levels. The first level is a personal level, which is the ability of individuals to get medical care when they need it. And at times of war, of course, the need is dire for medical care, and in the absence of which a person cannot survive in the place where he or she is without this medical care. The other level is the international level. You know, the World Health Organization talks about prevention and response to general health risks which can pose a threat to all countries, and they know no borders, as what we've seen with the COVID. Some studies indicate that we need to answer three questions regarding health security. And this takes us to the realm of non-classical security, which takes it beyond simply protecting the security of the country to the security of human beings or human security. And if we talk about that, we have to talk about the medical security or health security. And we need to first respond to the question, whose security are we talking about? The individual, the people, and from what? What are the risks we are dealing with? Are they like chronic diseases like cancer, diabetes, others which threaten individuals, or pandemics and epidemics like COVID, Zika, Ebola, and others which threaten societies? And also the resistance to antibiotics. And all of these are risks which can go beyond individual states to other countries. And also, when we say security, security from what? When we talk about state security, we're talking about weapons which are banned internationally, like radioactive, chemical, and others. And what are the steps, therefore, that we should take to mitigate these risks, like the availability to have access to medical care and have centers to monitor these pandemics, and also to reach fresh water and desalination, etc., etc. And if we apply that to Gaza, let's take these risks one after the other. First, having access to medical care. If we talk about the 7th of October, Gaza had already been suffering from the lack of proper medical care, and some of the indicators are the number of beds available. In Gaza, there were only 3,500 beds for 2.5 million people. So therefore, for every few thousand people, there is one bed or 1.5 beds. Now we have less than 1,000 beds for the entire population. So therefore, every 1,000 people in Gaza now have less access to less than half a bed. So this means that people will have to share half a bed. The other indicator, before the war, there were 2.2 doctors per 1,000 of the population. This was not bad, but now after the killing and the forceful expulsion of medical staff, the situation is even worse. So, to what extent are people able to fend for themselves, to buy medicine, to provide health care for themselves, and also the personal medical expenses? Every country tries to lower that to 15% or less. In Gaza, before the current conflict, it was 40%, and now is almost non-existent in view of the spread of poverty. And before the October War, 2/3 of the Gazan population were suffering from poverty. If we talk about referral of patients from one place to another in seek of health care and medical care, before the October War there was a lot of delay. After the war there was complete siege imposed on Gaza, and so the people who could not have access to health care were not able to leave Gaza, like cancer patients who could not get the proper treatment and their lives were threatened. And we're talking about 6 or 7 months of war. Definitely this kind of delay will increase the number of the death rates. And we're talking about 36 hospitals before the war in October. Now only 14 hospitals are still operational. And this is because of the deliberate targeting of hospitals. Unfortunately, recently in wars, healthcare has been targeted in a clear linkage between the ability of any community to resist and their ability to access healthcare. I can resist, but when my son is ill and I cannot have access to medical care, of course, I will be more prone to surrender or to leave my country. In the West Bank and Gaza, there were more than 187 attacks on healthcare facilities. In October, there were 410 attacks, as was documented by the World Health Organization on hospitals in Gaza. So therefore, from 32 hospitals before the war, now only 14 are operational, and we do not know for how long they can survive. So therefore, the Israeli occupation is using this targeting to weaken the resolve of the population and push them towards surrender. What impact will this have on the people in Gaza? We talked about chronic diseases, we talked about cancer. We have more than 2,000 cancer patients currently in Gaza have no access to radiology or chemotherapy or radiotherapy, dialysis, renal dialysis patients also. We have, before the war, half of the dialysis patients have died because they could not access the treatment. And now a patient who needs dialysis should have 3 sessions at least per week, and without that his life is threatened. What about hypertension, psychological conditions, mental health care conditions? We see people now have their children in their arms who have been killed by bombs, and this deep psychological impact on people without having access to any psychological care is huge. And Dr. Lambert talked about also other aspects. If 70% of the Gazan population now are having to drink polluted water, this will have a huge impact on diseases, on the spread of diseases. and 60% suffer from health security. Children under 5 are more susceptible to diseases because of dehydration, famine, and also the lack of desalinated water and the destruction of desalination plants. There are 3 types of disease which are threatening Gaza now. First is the waterborne diseases like cholera, and we know cholera was present in the area because of the war in Yemen. There was a cholera pandemic which reached Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So therefore, it's surrounding the Middle East region, and we may well see a cholera pandemic in Gaza because of the lack of desalinated water and purified water. Also, airborne diseases like COVID, but also measles is another threat, and this kind of diseases which can spread. One ill patient can spread it to 15. Measles, for example, is another disease. There are diseases which like the results of flea infestation, leprosy, and others which can spread through contact. There are the psychological conditions. There is severe cases of diarrhea, which are warning signs of cholera. We hope this will not proven to be true. There are other risks. People are not able to get the simple antibiotics and others with the lack of this, and this leads to inflammations as a result of the injuries they receive. Also, there are internationally banned weapons like white phosphorus. White phosphorus has an impact on skin burns, which can pierce the body into the flesh and bone and leave a huge impact on the respiratory system. So therefore, using these weapons has a huge impact on health. And with these risks that we talked about, will threaten the almost 2.5 million people in Gaza. This should make us all work hard and advocate for the ending of this war, not only to protect the people in Gaza, but also to avoid the spread of these diseases into other countries.
Thank you very much. The doctor in his presentation talked about the history of the role of medicine in wars and the doctor's attempt to advocate and pressure to stop wars. He defined health security and its dimensions and focused on the Gaza Strip and the potential in the hospitals and medical staff in the Gaza Strip right now, and the health and medical risks that will emerge as a result of this war, such as the breakout of communicative diseases, cholera, and respiratory diseases, resistance of antibiotics, and the impact of the weapons used and their health impacts. And he warned against the possibility of these diseases spreading not only in the Gaza Strip, but also in neighboring countries. We move on to the next presentation by Dr. Yasser Shalabi. He is an expert and researcher in development and social policies and an independent advisor in various developmental fields. He has PhD in social sciences and master's in international policies from the University of Birzeit, Palestine. He worked as a professor in the University of Birzeit in the master's program and in the departments of behavioral sciences and studies and cultural studies. He worked for many international and local institutions in social, economic, and political fields. He has many papers in migration, social protection, non-government organizations, and economy. Please go ahead. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Arab Center and the Strategic Studies Unit for inviting me to participate in this important symposium regarding the exceptional circumstances that Gaza Strip is going through. First, I would like to stress what my colleagues mentioned, that human security in Palestine in general and in Gaza Strip specifically is not just related to the transformational changes after the 7th of October, but it's also related to the existence of the Israeli occupation and what this means to regarding the control of crossings and borders and resources and the mobility of people. And so human security in Palestine was always threatened before the 7th of October. And with regards to my presentation on human security, food security as part of human security in Palestine, we are aware that human security has several components: economic, personal, health, food, social. All these dimensions in Palestine are subject to a crisis. And my colleagues discussed the environmental and health security. Economic security is one of the biggest problems facing Palestine because the Palestinian economy is connected to the Israeli economy as a relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, and there is no political security and or personal security in Palestine in light of the occupation. But I will focus on food security primarily in this presentation. Where were we and what are the transformations that happened after the 7th of October? The definition of food security as per the approved definition internationally, it is achieved when all people at all times have access to foods that are sufficient, safe, and nutritious, that meet their nutritious needs for an active and healthy life. This is the internationally approved definition, and the one that I used in my analysis. This definition has 4 dimensions, which is the availability of food and access to it, its use, and the stability of its access. And we will mention that in detail regarding every dimension and what happened to it after the 7th of October. So the reality of food security in Palestine, we are aware that before the 7th of October, Gaza used to suffer from low levels of livelihood and high levels of the lack of food security. This is as a result of occupation and the siege on Gaza since 2007. And the latest estimations before the 7th of October 2022, the lack of food security was 63% of Gaza Strip. But at least in that time, humanitarian aid used to enter the Strip. So 2/3 of the people used to access the aid, be it from the Palestinian government or from international institutions working in humanitarian activities, which had great activities in the Gaza Strip. So yes, a large portion of the people in Gaza had lack of food security, but we had tools to address this lack of food security with the aid provided by the various institutions. There are many factors. Many analysts connect the lack of food security before the 7th of October mainly to the low purchasing capacity of individuals in Gaza, unemployment. This is mainly the reason, but it was not connected to the availability of food or the market directly. This was impacted greatly after the 7th of October. After the 7th of October, we had very serious rates of the lack of food security. As my colleagues mentioned, the health care was weaponized and the destruction of environment was weaponized and starvation was used and weaponized in this war. And so the latest estimations published by international partners for integral food security categorization, they categorized the people into 5 degrees of food security. Until the degree of starvation, all the people of Gaza Strip were categorized into the 3rd degree of this categorization, which is the crisis or worse. And among these, 50% of the people are living in an emergency, a situation of emergency, which is the 4th degree. 30%, as per the latest estimations published 10 days ago, 30% are suffering from catastrophic circumstances. So we can say that they are suffering from famine. And as this is concentrated in the governorates of the northern Gaza, where humanitarian aid is not reaching people because the Israeli occupation is not letting this humanitarian aid reach these areas. So what are the factors that led to this high level of the lack of food security, other than weaponizing starvation? The interruption of the distribution of food items, the flow of food items to the Gaza Strip stopped. We had shortage of fuel due to Israel stopping the supply of energy and petrol into the Gaza Strip, and the infrastructure were severely damaged, including roads, water networks, electric networks, and this has led to a difficulty in distributing few food items. And the main concentration of this damage was in the governorates of Gaza and the northern Gaza, compared to the other 3 governorates in the center, Deir el-Balah and Khan Yunis. There was suspension of many agricultural facilities from production due to this led to destruction in agricultural productivity. Fishing has been suspended, and the fishing infrastructure was destroyed. Also, the high prices due to the limited amounts of food available, and these high prices came in the difficult livelihood, the spread of poverty at rates that are unprecedented, and the limited humanitarian aid flow into the Strip. And we are all watching the media and seeing the constraints that Israel is imposing on the entrance of this humanitarian aid, the difficulty to access healthcare services, as my colleague has mentioned. And this is one of the most important factors in worsening the situation of food security in Gaza, and also interrupting the supply of water in the Strip. And the four components of food security. First, the availability of food. And here we mean having appropriate amounts of good quality of food produced locally or imported. This includes humanitarian aid, food aid, and this is usually measured by production, food indicators, and transport indicators. All these indicators were negatively impacted after the 7th of October due to the Israeli constraints and the use of starvation as a weapon in this war. Of course, we are talking about the lack of food supply to the Gaza Strip as a main factor. Before 7th of October, 500 trucks used to enter Gaza Strip, and now we are talking about a reduced rate to 65 trucks daily since the 7th of October and until March of 2024. And so the problem here, the reduction of the supply in food items coming from outside Gaza, this is accompanied by a reduction in the local agricultural production due to the destruction that has occurred in the lands and agricultural facilities. Until 15th of February, as per the FAO report, until 15th of February, 42% of agricultural lands were destroyed, 26% of greenhouses were destroyed. Additionally, the Israeli aggression has destroyed a huge number of agricultural facilities. To talk about wells, water wells, 626 wells were destroyed, including household wells, also poultry farms, livestock farms. All of these that you can see on the screen in their numbers were destroyed until the 15th of February. Perhaps there are updates on further destruction. In addition to this, after the 15th of February, this has led to a huge reduction in agricultural production locally, and I highlight the destruction of the fishing port. And we know that the people of the Gaza Strip depend on fishing as one of the most important resources to provide them with the food in the strip. And so the fishing port was destroyed, and the boats of the fishermen were destroyed in this area. This also affects the lack of food security to a great extent in the Gaza Strip. Now, the ability to access food. All individuals must have access to sufficient resources to have adequate food. And here we talk about the material access, financial access, and social access. And we are talking about the availability of food and the people's access to this food. Material access, due to the continuous bombardment, people are not accessing markets and fishing, and this has negatively impacted the food security. Social access, meaning people's access to food through social media, this was also reduced or impacted because all families in Gaza are in need of aid. Before the 7th of October, in any community, social solidarity requires those who own things to give those who do not own things. But after the aggression after the 7th of October, everyone has become in need of help, and so social solidarity is impossible. Of course, there are aspects of social solidarity, but they are not the same as before the 7th of October. The factor that was most impacted in food security was the financial access to food. The aggression has impacted people's ability to have income and livelihood, be it people working in the Israeli market. We had 20,000 people from the Gaza Strip working in the Israeli market before the 7th of October. Fishermen have lost the ability to fish. Farmers, we have talked about how their lands were destroyed. And as for traders, there is no trade movement compared to before the 7th of October. And the two governors in the north of Gaza have no trade whatsoever, and other livelihoods that were completely suspended. And so estimations indicate that poverty is over 90% after 7th of October. They used to be 67.7% before the 7th of October. Unemployment increased unprecedentedly. They are now 74% in the fourth quarter of 2024 after the 7th of October. These are the estimations of the Palestinian Statistical Authority. They used to be 50% in the third quarter. So between the third quarter and the fourth quarter, we had a huge leap in unemployment, and this was accompanied with the high prices that were over 30% of the fourth quarter of 2024. Speaking about 2024, the prices increased even further due to the lack of food items and items in general and on the market. So using food, benefiting from food in an appropriate diet, also healthcare services, sanitation, all of this can lead to the well-being. The use of food can be measured in using parameters of practices, storage, safety of food, access to water. Of course, it is not possible for families to follow their preferred diet due to the lack of food items. Families are forced to consume what is on hand or what is available. Preparing food, especially hot meals, is available all the time. First, because of the interruption of the supply of energy, and because of the lack of food items needed to make hot meals, including meats and vegetables and so on. Families are forced to follow unhealthy diet practices. In Gaza, we've all seen on media that families are using animal fodder to make bread due to the lack of flour, and because the Israeli army is keeping any humanitarian aid from reaching the north of Gaza. The destruction of facilities, the interruption of the supply of energy has suspended the ability to store food. So they don't have refrigerators, they don't have storages, and a huge part of the storage houses or the warehouses were destroyed, and so there is no capacity to store the food for a long time, and so they need to consume whatever they get on a daily basis. And the also the interruption of the work of electricity had a huge impact on the safety of food. Another parameter that was mentioned by Dr. Lambert, the individual's share of water is less than 2 liters per day compared to the 50 liters of water that is recommended. And to comment on what Dr. Lambert had said, I believe that the comparison was not about the use of water for agricultural uses, because originally the crisis of water in Palestine generally and in Gaza specifically is that the Israeli occupation is dominating the water resources, the Palestinian resources. They are dominating 85% of water resources in Palestine, and as per the protocol 4 of the Oslo Accord, it is prohibited for Palestinians to develop water resources without the approval of the Palestinian-Israeli Committee, Joint Committee. Of course, the approval of both parties and the Israeli side since the Oslo Accord and until now has never approved any project to develop water resources. So this crisis is related to Israel's domination of water resources and not to the lack of water resources. And so it is a manufactured crisis and not one that is attributed to natural resources. So stability of food. For the food to be stable, the individual and family need to have sufficient food at all times, and they cannot risk losing food due to sudden crises, be it natural disasters, conflicts, and so on. This fourth component of the definition of food security includes all other three components, and which that I have mentioned, and they were all impacted negatively after the 7th of October. Lastly, I would like to say that I would like to ask what is required. How can we deal with the food security or the lack of food security in the Gaza Strip? I believe that we need to work on three levels. Short-term wise, we cannot increase the agricultural local production. And so the solution is to intensify humanitarian aid. This needs the efforts, Palestinian efforts, regional efforts to increase the humanitarian aid, and also to ensure or to pressure Israel to ensure this humanitarian aid reaches people in Gaza regardless of their whereabouts, especially the north of Gaza. Short-term-wise, we need to deal with the lack of food security using these methods. As for the medium term, we need to work to support the agricultural sector to enhance the local production of food and support the building of agricultural facilities. This is related to a developmental vision, a long-term developmental vision, by connecting food security to a developmental and a more comprehensive developmental aspect, and also the self-decision and human security must be achieved in Palestine. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Shalabi, for this important presentation where you have spoken about the occupation's impact on the lack of food security in Palestine and Gaza, specifically following the genocidal war. And Dr. Shalabi mentioned weaponizing starvation in this war and the levels of the lack of food security in the Gaza Strip. And he spoke about the main pillars of food security and analyzed them in the Gaza Strip, the amount of food, access to food, the use of food, and stability of food sources. And he presented a vision on how to address the lack of food security in the Gaza Strip on the short term, medium term, and a long-term strategy. Thank you very much, Dr. Shalabi. We now have the chance to receive, give you the opportunity to ask questions. Thank you, all three speakers. Two questions for Dr. Yasser Shalabi. First, is there are there numbers that clarify the food imports from Egypt and Israel in the Gaza Strip? Are there numbers that show how much we're getting from Egypt and from Israel? And the second question is about the criticism to the resistance, that they could have been more prepared to the period after 7th of October. How realistic is this criticism from your point of view as an expert? And specifically with regards to the storing food, the storage of food in the Gaza Strip, and the ability to provide food for a long time under siege. Thank you, Hani. I have questions for all the speakers. Question that there is a good description of the lack of human security in Gaza Strip, be it environmentally, the lack of water, and the lack of food security, all of these things that have become visible, and we are seeing it live, the extermination at all levels of life in the Gaza Strip. My question is about the effectiveness of the legal framework and humanitarian intervention in facing the lack of human security in the Gaza Strip, and the mechanism developed by the UN, so-called responsibility to protect. The other part of the question is related to the impact of the authority and interest and geopolitical interests dynamics on the humanitarian aspects in light of the genocide happening in Gaza right now. These are the questions that I have. Safe, go ahead, please. لدي سؤال مباشر للدكتور لامبرت
the human security, since you have mentioned 5 elements of the human security, the environmental and the food, the political and the other things in the diagram here, how long it takes after the first day after the war ended, how long it gonna take to restore the minimum of the minimum for the humans in Gaza?
Yes.
Thank you very much for this very important question. A very honest but vague answer is many years. But to answer it, I'd like also to mention something with regards to what my colleague had just said before, saying the water crisis is not natural. I would say a water crisis is never natural. It's always human-induced. Now, if we reformulate it, maybe we should ask, is it the water crisis due to the war or not? That is another matter. But what I wanted to emphasize here in my presentation, and maybe, I don't know if it was not exactly well explained by me, and then I will get to your question, is that we have water crisis in many places in the region. And when I mentioned that Gaza is a dry land, I was not trying to make excuses for the situation now. So I just want to be sure there was no misunderstanding with that. But there was already a water crisis before the current episode of very intense war on Gaza. It just made things totally worse. So in terms of statistics, we now have 1 to 2 to maximum, in some places, 3 liters of water per day per person, which is nothing. For the United Nations, below 100 liters per person per day, you're in water insecurity and a grave situation, actually. So you can imagine with, in average, 1 to 3 liters per person per day, the situation now is extremely catastrophic. That doesn't mean it was good before, but it made things even worse. But I wanted to emphasize that it was on purpose, and water crises are never natural. So when I mentioned that Gaza was a dry land, it was not to make any excuse, just for answering this. But now, the reason I've mentioned this is that it takes even more time when the environment you start with is not really conducive to having big cities. What do I mean is that there will be a lot of investments needed in infrastructure because the ecosystems do not have in Gaza the similar resilience capacities that you would have in other places. And just explain this, the amount of rainfall that fall in Gaza are much smaller than in other areas. And thus, the amount of time that water will need to come to flush, let's say, pollutants, to replenish underground water, which has been salinized by the Israelis pumping seawater into tunnels, but also groundwater, this will take a lot of time to be restored because it will almost all have to be man-made restoration. The resilience of the ecosystem would take too much time. So now, to give a bit more answer to what you say, it will take a lot of time, maybe decades, if the Israelis put borders and barriers, to the aid coming into Gaza. However, for restoration of some key ecosystemic services, fresh water, etc., it could take 5 to 6, 7 years if the international community can come and invest in solar desalination plants, for instance. Remediation strategies for the soils which have been destroyed in the east for agriculture to be restored. That would take money, but this is not impossible. UNDP knows about that. Restoration of ecosystems after war, this is something which has been ongoing since the 1990s. So this is something that can be done. But it will really depend, first and foremost, on how much the Israelis let the international community have access to the Gaza Strip and how much material can enter. We should remind here that for whatever reasons, you can have items blocked at the entry, the passages into Gaza. So a lot of so-called dual-use materials cannot enter the Gaza Strip. So I don't see how we can make solar desalination stations enter, because a lot of the technologies in it can be, let's be honest, used for other purposes. So the Israelis will use that to forbid the introduction of solar desalination plants. Just to give an example, pumping also plants, for agriculture, etc., etc. So they use it now to limit the amount of humanitarian aid going into. They are very likely to use it in the future for restoration purposes by the international community. So it might take decades. But hopefully, if the international community seems to be continuing the shift which is happening, because there is a shift in the international community, the way the UK, the way Germany, even Germany, which is really strongly with Israel, but even the way Germany is now speaking is very different than what was happening 4 months ago. So if this continues, we have some hope that the reconstruction will be faster. Thank you.
شكرا دكتور لامبرت. دكتور ياسر.
Dr. Yasser Shalabi, please. Dr. Yasser. Thank you for your questions. Of course, there are figures for imports in general for Palestine and the Gaza Strip. I don't have them readily available. I have to refer back to my notes. We know at the level of Palestine as part of the security, food security, and that most of our imports are either from Israel or through Israel. So therefore, the Palestinian economy's dependence on Israeli economy is one of the issues we have which impact the human security in Palestine in general and in Gaza in particular. As for criticizing the resistance, should have had stockpile of food. It's not just the resistance. We as Palestinians in general, we all have shortcomings. Is the West Bank now ready for a crisis which is less severe than the Gaza? Of course not. There have been suggestions of building silos to store food. This was a step in the right direction, but the question of Palestinian resistance only, but Palestine in general, we are not fully prepared for crises, not just conflicts. At the pandemic, COVID pandemic, we had a problem. The first intifada, we had a problem. The second intifada, we had a problem. So therefore, the Palestinian society should be raising the level of its readiness in general, not just the resistance. And food storage is a problem, definitely, at the Palestinian level, whether at the West Bank or Gaza. And this is because of the lack of the proper, adequate infrastructure to store food in a safe way for long terms. I don't know if I answered all your questions or not. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yasser. Dr. Abdul Karim, if you have any addition or comment. I want to remind us that health security issues are not given enough attention, and we must also remember that health is used as a weapon, whether through direct targeting of health facilities or killing or imprisoning medical staff, or through banning the material used by hospitals, or the fuel hospitals need. The very few hospitals which remain operational in Gaza will cease to be operational if the food supplies finishes. So therefore, the Israeli occupation, when they exercise their control over the supply of electricity, water, means that the lifeline of life for Gazan people is in the hands of the Israelis. The health sector should be fully considered as neutral, and this sector should be taken away from the control of the Israelis, which is using it to impose its will on the Palestinian people, because this is a very important aspect of human security, which we should always focus on in our advocacy to deal with this aggression, not only when it comes to the 7th of October war, but in all aspects of life in Gaza after the war. Thank you, Dr. Abdul Karim. Dr. Muhannad, you have a question? شكرا جزيلا. سؤالي لك لورن.
Israeli military in Gaza would basically result in ecological destruction, and this destruction is long-term. What is the fall-off on Israeli-controlled areas, especially those cities right on the borders with Gaza? When do you think the fall-off would be felt in these areas, if at all?
Thank you. Very good question. And this is really where we see that the Netanyahu approach to war is really an approach where there is no human security taken into consideration from the Israeli side. because if you just take the amount of dust and thus thin particle air pollution coming from the very, very heavy bombing, we should really say it's been extraordinary. Again, many colleagues have highlighted that this is the worst kind of bombing since World War II in terms of the amount and intensity of bombing. The dust pollution is very acute. Thus, air quality, or the lack thereof, is very dangerous for people living there. So right now, many of these cities close to Gaza are evacuated. But it's not sure when they will be able to come back because, again, it's a long-term issue. Because it's not just air being polluted, it's also the vast amount of dust, which have been projected onto other ecosystems. It's also a lot of materials, some of which are radioactive, some of which are, there has been this use of white phosphorus. So we have soils which are heavily contaminated. It's important to understand that in the Negev and in areas also very close to the Gaza Strip, these were agricultural, sometimes, places. Well, their soils and definitely their waters are suffering in terms of quality deterioration. Many people say Netanyahu doesn't care about these people. Many of them are left-wing people living in kibbutzim. So this is not the people who vote for Netanyahu and his coalition. He just doesn't care. That might be a reason why, but definitely the way the war is conducted shows that he doesn't care about the long-term consequences for neighboring populations. And I would also even say for populations, because winds travel and like health, no border. For the populations in the rest of Israel, they will be affected definitely by the air quality. I mean, here, for instance, in Doha, we're affected by the issues of air quality from Iraq and Iran. You see how far it is. So it would be, foolish to think that in Tel Aviv or Haifa, they are not affected by what is next door in Gaza happening. So I hope it answered your question. Thanks.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much. I thank our three speakers, and we thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and all our followers through the social media. Thank you.